This is the frontispiece of the dialogue on the two great world systems. There's a real sense, though, in which an earlier book called The Essayer, or Il Saggiatore, was actually much more risky than the dialogue. Pietro Redondi, an Italian historian of science, argued this a generation ago. The Saggiatore dealt with matter theory. It's atomistic. As such, it could be taken, and in fact was taken, as directly critical of the doctrine of the Eucharist. So it was central to Catholic faith in a way that really the Copernican question wasn't. And sure enough, there was in fact a denunciation of Galileo to the Vatican for the Essayer, for the Saggiatore, on very much these grounds, but there was no trial for the Saggiatore. 10 years later, however, the Vatican proved to be remorseless in pursuing Galileo for a quite different and arguably less provocative work, a work for which there was no denunciation, in fact. And one doesn't have to accept all of Pietro Redondi's famously controversial arguments to be puzzled by this and to ask why. Well, the answer, I think, lies in a crucial difference between the local conditions of reading that were applied to these two works. Both the Essayer and the dialogue were products, in part, of an aristocratic group of virtuosi, that is, kind of learned lay intellectuals, calling themselves the Lincei, or the Lynxes, a group that saw itself as standing in the vanguard of intellectual reform, in opposition to the forces propping up the Counter-Reformation. Their leader was a Roman nobleman called Federico Cesi, you can see here. The Lincei were anti-Aristotelian, they were anti-Jesuit, they were anti-university. They took the name Lincei from a book, from the title page of one of the most famous books of natural magic of the time, Baptista della Porta's Magia Naturalis. That thing that looks a bit like a dog at the top of the page is actually a lynx, which is an emblem of being percipient, of clear-sightedness and far-sightedness. And the motto of the book was about the need to look out and look in. And this is what the Lincei thought they would do. They would be clear-sighted in a way that Aristotelians were not. Porta himself joined the group in 1610, shortly to be followed by Galileo. And the idea of this group was that they would create a kind of encyclopedic new knowledge of nature, a project that never really disappeared. But Porta's death in 1615, Porta was going to be the principal author of this, cast it into abeyance. When he died, the Lincei settled on a new champion, and that new champion was Galileo. As a result of this, they used, over a period of about 20 years, a series of arguments about nature to try to push Galileo into a position of intellectual authority in the Catholic Church. The Copernican issue was only one of them. They also used comet theory, sunspots, matter theory, all kinds of things. Each of the controversies that Galileo got involved with was in that sense not simply about Galileo. It was a product of this kind of collective group of the Lincei. And in particular, I want to point to one of the leading lights of the Lincei, a young disciple of Galileo's called Giovanni Ciampoli, who is now completely unknown. And he's completely unknown for a reason, which was that he was effectively kind of wiped out of history. Ciampoli was a Florentine like Galileo, and he'd been a pupil of Galileo for a while, but when Galileo joined the Lynxes, the Lincei. He was also a client of a famous cardinal, Maffeo Barberini, who became Pope Urban VIII, who had been a patron of Galileo's and of the Lincei. Ciampoli wrote several natural philosophy and scientific works himself, most of which are now completely lost. And he was renowned for his rhetorical skills. He was also renowned for being something of a joker. He was seen as arrogant, and he was reputedly something of a libertine. But he rose quickly in the patronage circles of Rome. By 1619, 1620, he was one of the group of Lincei who were pushing Galileo forward as the champion of the new science, if you like, against the Jesuits, the Counter-Reformation, and a particular Jesuit champion, a figure called Orazio Grassi, who was an architect and mathematician in Rome. And the stakes here were to secure intellectual authority over the Catholic Church. That's what the Saggiatore was for. It was an attack on Grassi in particular, and Jesuit intellectual power more broadly. By the time it was finished, Ciampoli had reached the point of being the Pope's Secretary of Briefs in Rome. The old Pope had just died. Ciampoli was instrumental to the manoeuvres that then followed. In fact, that whole process that we have now of papal elections with the clouds and so forth is one that we owe to Ciampoli. He invented that mechanism. So he became the kind of mediator between the Lincei, the Lynxes, and Galileo in particular, and the Pope. Barberini, who became Pope, had been, as I say, a long-time patron of these Florentine innovators. So the Essaya had been edited by the Lincei. It wasn't a single production by Galileo, it was by them as a group. And it then arrived in Rome. Now the Jesuits, who, as I say, were Galileo's principal target here, had heard that this book was coming, and they frequented the Roman bookstores until they found it, at which point Grassi appeared in print very fast with a rebuttal of it. And it was denounced in writing, probably by Grassi, to the Holy Office for atomism, which was a very dangerous doctrine. So Grassi then was a senior official, he had the power of the Jesuits behind him, he denounced this book to the Holy Office. Nothing happened. Why not? Well, the answer lies in the courtly presentation, the courtly habit of presenting books. If you were in a courtly world and you wrote a book and you published it, this was what you wanted to do. You wanted to present your book to the patron. We have no image of this happening with Galileo. This is actually the Danish astronomer Hevelius from a generation later, presenting his book to Louis XIV in France. So on October the 27th, the Saggiatore, the Essay, was presented to the Pope in the middle of a group of cardinals. And in the following days, Pope Urban had Ciampoli read the book aloud to him over dinner. Ciampoli selected choice passages for their wit, and the Pope appreciated this so much that he would have Ciampoli repeat these passages over again. They were voiced with flair. Ciampoli was a renowned rhetorician. Soon, prized bits of Galilean rhetoric were circulating freely among Rome's admiring courtiers, and it's interesting that they're still regarded as great moments in Italian literature to this day. And the Pope himself gave Galileo a private audience. Galileo became a kind of star in Rome at this point. And it was because of this triumph that Galileo came to believe that he was now free to embark on a work proving Copernicanism. He'd previously been kind of slightly tacitly told that he couldn't do this. He wanted to use an argument that he believed proved the Earth to be in motion around the Sun, something that nobody had ever managed to do before, an argument based on the phenomena of the tides. So he left Rome after this private audience, clutching a papal commendation that had actually been composed by Ciampoli, believing that he could now write the famous book on the tides, and that was what became the dialogue. So the dialogue emerged from this triumphant reading experience. And it was supposed to arrive in Rome under the same conditions. Ciampoli was going to read it to the Pope, in the same way as he'd read the Saggiatore. And the Lincei, the Lynxes, had every reason to believe that it would be an equal triumph. Copernicanism, as I say, was a less controversial topic than atomism, and the dialogue was written with Galileo's customary rhetorical flair. But everything depended on how the book would be received. And Galileo actually wrote, rather anxiously, to Ciampoli to make sure that he was still in position, that this reading would happen properly. But in the early 1630s, the book got delayed. One of the reasons for this was that plague broke out in Florence, between Florence and Rome. The book had to be torn apart, page by page, and fumigated to make sure that it would be safe for people to read when it got to Rome. And by the time it did arrive in Rome, a crucial change had happened, which was that Ciampoli had been forced into exile. Briefly, there had been a Spanish faction associated with the Jesuits, who in the early 1630s engineered an actual fist fight in the consistory between rival groups of cardinals. The Pope had to call the Spanish guards to pull the cardinals apart. And from that moment, the Pope became convinced that he was the subject of Spanish-inspired plots to have him assassinated. Ciampoli became associated with this Spanish faction and lost favour with the Pope, and the Pope exiled him. And it's because of that he disappears from history. That happened in November 1632, while Galileo's book was trundling south from Florence and being pulled apart and put back together again. Now, most people assumed that this swift fall was because of suspicions of intriguing with the Spanish, but there's an interesting counter-story that also arrived at the same time. The Medici ambassador thought that it was because he presumed to improve on the Pope's prose. The idea was that the Pope had shown Ciampoli a letter that the Pope had composed, only for Ciampoli to intervene and improve the rhetoric of the letter before sending it on, which the Pope resented as an affront. It seemed that Ciampoli was kind of showing his superiority in this way. And what's interesting about this is that this associated Ciampoli with an effort to twist the Pope's words, perhaps to snide effect, and to do so in a context of conspiracy. So as soon as he dismissed him, the Pope started to think that what Ciampoli had been working on, which was the shepherding of Galileo's book through the licensing censorship regime, was another example of this snide use of words. He was overheard in his chambers to accuse Ciampoli of what he called a ciampolata, which is a kind of a Ciampoli affair, a Ciampoli conspiracy, around this book by Galileo. And it's at this point that Urban, the Pope, ordered the book to be suppressed. So 10 years earlier, Ciampoli had been in a position to read a book to the Pope and make it a success. Now, not only could he not do this, but the book, when it did arrive in Rome, was associated precisely with the use of words to undermine the Pope's authority. Now this book was going to be read for mischief, and it was, literally from beginning to end. So when the Pope got hold of a copy, one of the first things he saw was this, which is the printer's emblem on the title page. It's 3 dolphins with a motto that says, "I have grown with my family." And this was an emblem that had been used countless times by this printer. The Pope seized upon it now and assumed that it was a joke at the expense of papal nepotism. The Pope was one of 3 Barberini brothers who were high up in the church, and it was taken now to be an accusation that he was corrupt. And at the very end of the book, the Pope came across a critical passage by Galileo, which was now read in precisely the wrong fashion, most unfortunate fashion. At the very close of the book, after Galileo has, he thinks, proven Copernicanism to be true, that the Earth goes around the Sun, he doesn't then drive that home at the end. What he does is to have the Aristotelian person in the dialogue, the stupid person in the dialogue, if you like, say, "Ah, yes, but God being omnipotent, he could have made the phenomena of the world in the way that they appear, with the causal structure being in any way that he wanted. So it could still be the case that the Earth was stationary, and it's just the appearances that are like this. That's the only way of saving God's omnipotence. And we must be duly humble for doing this." And he says something like, a worthy but unnamed interlocutor had told him this story, this account. Now the thing about that was that it was completely true, but the worthy but unnamed interlocutor was actually the Pope. It was known that this was the Pope's favourite response to the whole Copernican issue, that we should be modest about imputing to God particular forms of causation on the grounds of God's omnipotence. So here, the Pope suddenly thought, here was the Ciampolata, here was where Ciampoli and his allies had decided to show the Pope up as something of a fool. And it's with resentment at that affront that Urban decided to prosecute the book to the ultimate possible extent. It's very clear that the Pope personally pursued this, and it was only after that he did this that denunciations started to appear from the Jesuits and so forth. So the whole Galileo affair sprang in part from changes in the circumstances of reading. The mediation of it fell apart. The first book, despite a formal denunciation, received only praise after being read aloud by an acclaimed rhetorician. The second book, despite no denunciation, became the vehicle for the most notorious clash between science and religion in history, because there was no such reading. Now, of course, these circumstances of reading themselves require a certain kind of explanation. You'd have to look to things like diplomacy, patronage structures, the 30 Years' War, and locally the representations of people like printers and booksellers. And of course, what Galileo actually wrote mattered quite a lot, because that was what Ciampoli had to work with. But it's plausible, I think, to conceive of a possible world in which Ciampoli didn't fall, or at least didn't fall quite so quickly or abruptly, and had still been in place when Galileo's book had arrived in Rome. Would the Galileo trial then have happened? I think it's reasonable to suggest that it might not. And the ramifications of that would have been momentous, because it might well have been that Galileo and the Lincei, the Lynxes, would have succeeded in their aim of making Copernicanism at least an accepted option within high Catholic culture. And that would have been a transforming moment compared to how the history of science and religion